Back in 2014, I was out camping with my friends out in the Ammermoor region of Queensland. There were Phil and Tony, my ute, and an esky full of grog and sausages. We were set for a good camp out. We were driving through the forest, through some of the tracks, and found a secluded spot by a creek to set up camp for the night. We were sitting around a fire having a barbie and a couple tinnies, and sitting back having a fish. We were catching mostly dewfish, except for one fair-sized bass and a turtle. Sometime through the night, everything seemed to go silent. It was a fairly bright night, and earlier the birds were crying out. Frogs were frogging, crickets were chirping. Now as we were all getting tired and conversation lulled, we noticed it. Silence except for the fire and the sounds of the creek. It was unnerving. Phil noted it out loud, and the unease in the glances between each of us made the moment feel more tense. It was broken when a loud splash sounded from up the creek. It was like a massive rock was thrown into the water. We all gazed toward the sound, but nothing could be seen. We assumed it was a fish jumping in the creek or branch falling or something. After a few terrifying minutes, the sounds of the animals began again, and it was as if the silence never was. We put off sleep for a while to clear the nerves. Tony hooked something big, and we excitedly watched as his line snapped. Phil and I tried casting out, and we both caught nothing but snags. We set up swags in a triangle around the fire and decided to call it a night. Within minutes, Phil was fast asleep and snoring loudly. I was gazing up at the stars through my fly screen, just about to drift off to sleep, when I noticed that the silence had returned. It was only Phil snoring and the lapping of the water along the shallows that sounded. The fire had died down a bit by now, and the wind was still. I could hear sporadic things, leaves scuffling, twigs breaking every now and again. Isolated nature sounds amongst the silence. My heart stopped when I heard some stones on the riverbank move. When it sounded again, not once but twice, I began to hold my breath. Initially, I shook my head at myself. It was just a critter of some sort, no doubt, but the back of my mind was telling me it sounded awfully like footsteps. I took shallow breaths as I waited for the sound again, but it was silent for a good minute. I'd finally just began to breathe normally when I heard the sound again, but from the other side of my swag, a few meters away. I could hear sniffing, then the sound of stealthy movement as this thing creeped across the ground toward my swag. The flap was pulled down so I could see the sky and the fire. The other side was still covered. I could hear this thing breathing heavy breaths on the other side of the canvas. Then I hear the sounds of something touching the canvas itself, centimeters from my face. At the time I assumed it was a wild dog or perhaps even a pig, maybe. Unlikely, but my head was swimming. The sniffing sounded peculiar. The nostrils sounded large, like the breathing was more hollow. I could see the canvas move in towards me as whatever it was inspected my thin cocoon. I felt trapped. The canvas was moving toward the mozzie netting, and then I saw it, brownish yellow long fingers with obsidian black nails. "I'm not gonna lie!" I screamed the loudest, highest pitched squeal I think anyone could manage. I flipped shit. I started kicking and flailing. Tony let out a "what the fuck" before an even more expressive "what the fuck" before flipping out like I was. I heard a loud hoo-hoop sound from a distance, and the thing that was above me ran away from our screams across the riverbank and loudly crashed into the water. Phil began shouting as he awoke to our panic and hearing the splashing. Tony and I had already scrambled out of our swags and were legging it to the car. I could have beat Kathy Freeman that night. Phil joined us as we shouted at him to get to the fuck over. He didn't need much persuasion as he looked at our strewn belongings and terrified faces. We got in the ute, leaving our stuff behind. My dad was pissed because it was his swag I was using, and as I turned on the headlights, a yellowish-brown and abnormally tall shape of a person moved behind a large tree. Phil saw what we saw this time and started going mental. I floored it through that forestry. I fucked some panels, and my suspension hated me for it. But we got the fuck out of that forestry. Every creek crossing was terrifying. We finally got off the dirt roads and were heading back toward town. We crossed a small bridge, and from one side to the other was a trail of splashed water, as if something or someone dripping wet moved from one side to the other. It could have just been water, but after what we saw, we were convinced it was the same creatures. Tony said later on that he saw the thing crouched over my swag when I screamed. He said he had his eyes closed and was listening to the sounds of a weird swirling sound in the water. He said he never heard footsteps. He told me the creature had overly large eyes, was all cheekbones and head ridges. He reckons it was an alien. I reckon differently. That was the last time I went out camping with the boys. I later moved to the city, but whenever I go back near the area and drive over a creek or the river, I'm waiting to look down and see eyes staring up at me from the water. I don't know what it was, and don't plan on finding out. I don't go near bodies of water anymore. Even the beach gives me the heebie-jeebs. Does anyone know what the fuck we came across that night? I haven't heard anything remotely similar to this anywhere around here. When we tell people, they think we're talking shit, but we all saw something, and we agree it was human-like, but it was no person. The creek leads into the Mary River that is home to prehistoric creatures like the lungfish. Something strange lives in those depths.